This is Mr. McKeever here, and today we're going to talk about slaves in the Atlantic slave trade. So let's begin this by just preface this very simply. Is this the first time that slaves have ever existed in the world? Uh, if anyone is unaware of this, the answer is without a doubt, no. It's just reality. Slaves existed a long time, but what makes this different during our discussion is three things. First, the scope of slavery and the slave trade. There's never in the history of humanity ever going to be any sort of trade or practice of slavery anywhere near to the size of what we're going to see during the Atlantic slave trade. Second, the actual condition of the slave itself and what happens to the slave. In earlier forms of slavery, when we see the Romans doing it, the Greeks, the Egyptians, whoever, the slave was actually a relatively valued member of the family unit. They're going to be treated extraordinarily well because their close relationship with members of the family make them almost like family. That's not going to be the reality of the slave trade as we see it during this period. And also the global impact, the implication that the slave trade had on global economics, on trade across the globe and different areas, the impact it had on the New World and on Africa, let alone the wealth that it produced for European nations. All right, so let's start out with this. First thing on our agenda list is the various scope that happens with this. Up to this point, the Spanish and the Portuguese have been using the native populations in the New World for slaves. But they run into the slave problem with the slaves dying off because largely due to smallpox and various other diseases. So they're going to need to find a way to produce more slaves or acquire more slaves. And it really wasn't fashionable at the time to use Europeans for slaves, largely because they were already Christian citizens and you don't enslave Christians. So the first place on their agenda list is going to be Africa. So they're going to look towards the nations of Africa, the small empires and stuff that exist there, and see if they can find people who are willing to give slaves. And what we're actually going to see is the very beginnings and the birth of the Atlantic slave trade. What is important to distinct here, at least remember in regards to what we kind of know about slaves later on, is that slave communities or African communities gave these slaves up. In fact, oftentimes they were African communities themselves gathering Africans from rival tribes after wars and then selling those to the Europeans, oftentimes for the exchange of guns or in some cases, technology, vaccines, medicine, whatever it is. But Europeans themselves did not go into Africa searching for slaves. They actually came to the coastlines, and the Africans would bring these budding slaves, if you will, to the coastline for the Europeans to sell. Well, when African societies could no longer meet the demands of the European traders, they actually began starting conflicts with their neighbors in order to gain them for slaves. This is actually going to completely obliterate African society as a whole, and this is where we start to talk about the implications to the global community. Most African societies are going to be completely destroyed out of this lust for more slaves and the wealth that comes by selling slaves. And it's from here on out that everything just becomes extraordinarily disastrous. And the whole situation where slavery having existed before, but as a relatively modest institution, is going to be blown out of proportion. Life of slavery or life of slaves during this period is just it's catastrophic when we compare it to earlier ages in slavery and even of course our own modern standards of what human beings and natural rights of human beings should have. What does it look like? This graphic actually shows you a very good distinction of what it was actually like across the ocean. We're talking 2 to 3 months across the Atlantic. And in that time period, you had a full space of 4 square feet. That is an insanely small amount of space for the average person. So, for all intents and purposes, you stayed laying down in your ship for 2 months. Now, as you guys I'm sure can imagine, the amount of disease that comes out of this, because we're packing in hundreds of people into these ships with zero space. I promise you, there's no sanitation concerns ever taken into consideration here. So we have literally just decks upon decks of people covered in their own human filth. There's never enough food. And of course, the people in the slave ships, the sailors on these ships, would oftentimes abuse women and children. They would be called onto the top deck, and then women would be used for various illicit purposes, mostly sexual favors and things like that, and children would be used for entertainment purposes. They would force the kids to fight. Whoever lives gets to eat, the other person dies, and this would be the kind of situation that many of them lived through. And then outside of that, particularly for African men, they were all chained the entire time. So when we're seeing this entire transition of 2 months from Africa to the New World, the death toll is catastrophic. Odds are roughly 30-ish, 30 to 40% of the slaves that are actually packed into the boats in Africa are actually making it to the New World. What's also important to remember here is where they're going. The overwhelming majority of people coming to the New World from Africa are not coming to the North American continent. They're coming to Latin America and particularly Brazil. The Portuguese are going to be extraordinarily dependent upon the use of African slaves. There was never that large of a native population in Portuguese Brazil to begin with, and after the diseases thoroughly spread out and dispersed what's left of them, they're pretty much exclusively dependent upon African slaves for labor. The British will use slaves in their Spice Islands in the Caribbean, but not to the degree that the Spanish will or that the French will. It's going to be significantly more pronounced in those areas. When we see this, we see some pretty explicit, abuses towards life. There are massive work requirements for any slave that is brought over to the New World. Once they are sold, they're immediately put to work in 14 to 15-hour shifts a day, working in hard laboring fields. They're very rarely fed or fed well, maybe fed 2 or 3 times a week, and that is it. And odds are you had 10 to 15 slaves living in a small shack. And this is going to lead to, again, massive disease. Malnutrition is going to be an issue. And it's actually not until significantly later on, towards the North American continent and eventually in the Caribbean, that slave owners started to realize that if you treat your slave just slightly better, their longevity is exponentially larger, and they're not spending nearly as much time and money on replacing slaves. Well, another consequence of this whole slave trade and slave economy that exists is we're going to see brand new slave codes placed into these colonies. Because the populations would be so predominantly African slaves, there was this legitimate fear that if the slaves ever revolted, the Europeans would be massively outnumbered. And eventually, this is actually going to happen in places like Haiti, with the French, and in other places eventually in Mexico and South America with the Spanish, but not until much later on. What is incorporated in these slave codes is, pretty much every possible thing that you can imagine. Any sort of physical punishment, whipping people, beating people, lynching people, whatever it is, not an issue. There's very clear rules as to marriage in that there aren't any. Any African marriage that they propose is not legal because marriage is something that implies equal partnership, and the slaves were property, not people. And the slave owners had no problem selling off the wife of one person or the spouse of another. And because of that, slaves were not allowed to marry. And because, again, they are property, the parents have no rights to the children. Now, what we would often see is that a slave owner will not allow a kid to be sold until the child has reached the age of at least 5 or 6, largely because he's still physically dependent upon the mother. We oftentimes see during this time women are breastfeeding much later into the life of the child than we do assume today, because that was really the only source of nutrition that the child could get. We're seeing kids who are receiving nutrients from a mother until they're age 3, 4 years old, just because that's the only food that's around. And then lastly, another feature of the slavery that we see during this time period is that Christianity is going to be heavily pushed upon the native peoples. Most native traditions from Africa are going to go extinct, but we do see some people attempting to incorporate some of these traditions into Christian theology, Christian ideology. And we actually see very active Laity movements that actually break out throughout the area, which are very characteristic of the African tribal religions, where everyone participates, strong reliance on dance, on music, to portray the message of religion itself. And that will actually be incorporated into Christianity in many forms of Southern Baptist religion. So, what is the lasting impact of slavery when it comes to this global theme? Well, because Europeans are trying to bring Christianity to everywhere, we get this ideology called the white man's burden. where it's the white man's responsibility to civilize and make human these, in many cases, they view it like half devil children who are not entirely human, who are too dumb to live life on their own and focus things in mindsets of a rational adult. And this is actually where we see the birth of modern racism. We see a lot of the same symbolism that is applied to African slaves in the 15s and 1600s that is still actually used to justify certain actions in today's world. And it's, you know, quite depressing, but it's pretty prevalent across the globe still today. We're going to talk more about white man's burden a little bit later on as well too. In Africa, the tribal empires that existed are pretty much all destroyed. There's a massive power vacuum within those countries and within those empires, and Europeans are going to fill those for the Africans. And actually, it's going to be largely European churches are going to become the new social hierarchy in these areas. It's part of this whole missionary movement. We'll see Africa itself become a massive push to colonize, particularly in areas where slaves, for the most part, at least the slave trade, will become eventually outlawed. It just allows Europeans to take the areas themselves for colonies and then use the people in those areas as a source of labor. And instead of having the actual manufacturing or creation taking place in the New World, it'll take place in Africa itself. And this will allow for the creation of a lot of goods just, created in Africa and shipped back to the European nations or to North America. Also, we see a massive population imbalance that exists in Africa at the time. Men are oftentimes taken as their better sources of labor, and women are left behind. And we see situations where there's 4, 5, 6 women to every one man in a village. This will oftentimes lead to massive demographic problems, and societies will disappear. And then lastly, any sort of regional economy that existed, tribal communities that had worked and coexisted for 100 years, for all intents and purposes, are destroyed. There's nothing left of the groups. They started harvesting each other for human slaves to get European goods. And Africa itself will be, for all intents and purposes, completely destroyed. And the social hierarchy of Africa has never recovered from this experience, beginning with the early African slave trade. And this will kind of set us up for later on. The African slave trade is going to play a vital role later in our discussion as to this globalized economy that's starting to take place at the beginning of the imperialist age. So you guys have a wonderful weekend. We'll kind of pick this up next week, and adios.